All right. Hi,
Yeah.
everybody. I can see this room is filling up very, very fast. I am Catherine Zaleski, co-founder, president of PowerToFly, joined here today by Maxine Williams, the Global Chief Diversity Officer at Facebook. Before I introduce Maxine with a longer introduction, I'm going to go over some very quick housekeeping notes. So a lot of you are here getting SHRM credits. If you need to access your SHRM credit ID for this talk, you can see that it's up there in the corner of this slide. This conversation will be a chat between me and Maxine. We do have some pre-submitted questions from our community that we're going to go into towards the end. So I'm very excited to get into those as well. And finally, I want to start off the talk today by thanking everybody for being here. It's thanking Maxine for being here. It's a very historic week with the Supreme Court decision. And obviously a lot of things are changing across the United States in terms of police reform and other racial justice movements that are finally starting to make an impact. Not enough, but we're seeing movement. So it's fantastic to be able to talk to you today and have this conversation. I want to start out by understanding your journey a little bit more. I interviewed you about 3 years ago when I think you were 4 years into your tenure at Facebook. Now it's been 7 years. It's a young company, but 7 years. So 7 years is you've seen a lot of change, which is fantastic. So I would love, tell me a little bit more about your own journey and how you got to Facebook.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for having me and for inviting me into the Power community. It is a pleasure to be connected to people who are also in this work. It can be work that is hard and often lonely. So any moment to connect and support and share with each other is one that I really value.
Thank you.
My journey is, I guess, an interesting one, and one that makes it clear that being in diversity was probably something that I was bound to do, because it is a journey which has had many different elements to it. There was never any one track or one road that I was on. If I, looking back and connecting the dots, the word justice comes to mind. I was always doing something which was with that end, thinking about how we bring more opportunity to more people, equality, equity, fairness. Those are always things that I was sort of in pursuit of, but in different forms. So as you could probably tell by my accent, I am an immigrant to the United States. I was born and grew up in Trinidad and Tobago, and moved here, at various times for different reasons, but I've also lived in different countries around the world. And professionally, as I say, it's interesting, I'm trained as a lawyer. And what I did mostly when I practiced law was represent trade unions. So, teachers, workers in oil fields, workers in banks, like a whole variety of issues, but all from the worker perspective. But then I also did other work that represented state entities, environmental protection agencies. So it was a mixed bag, but predominantly in the industrial court, representing workers through unions. I also ran a human rights organization for a couple of years, which was multi-country. It was a network, and again, looked at a range of different issues, from indigenous land issues to people with disabilities, prison reform, working to help abolish the death penalty. When you go under the human rights banner, there's so many different elements to that as well. So I did that for a while, and then got into D&I, where I did that squarely for 7 years before coming to Facebook, where I have now been for another 7 years. So I've been really in this D&I, but leveraging what I learned in all these different places and all these different countries throughout my time before coming on this journey, and then putting it into this corporate context, really, right? Which merges the private with the public. So this has also been an interesting journey as well.
but for the biggest, most diverse community in the world. So
Right.
the background is
Right.
obviously very critical. By the way, in my excitement of introducing you, I forgot to thank Facebook for also supporting this conference as well. So there's been some incredible conversations that have been had here around racial justice within workplaces and beyond. And so to have you, who represents such a huge community here, is really fascinating. I want to that point around D&I and diversity. I've heard you speak in the past around definitions of diversity when you're dealing with such a massive community. Can you speak to that definition that's at Facebook, what you've implemented there, and or what you've defined there, rather?
Yeah, look, I think obviously there are many different definitions you can use, right? What we are focused on is what is the objective? Because I think people can often get stuck and unfortunately think that you are doing something for the sake of doing it when we are doing this with a goal, with a purpose. And the end goal for us as a company is to build better products, to make better decisions, to serve the people who use our services, our platforms, to serve them in a better way, recognizing that they are such an incredibly diverse community, right? You can't serve 3 billion people and not have just such incredible diversity. So what we are trying to achieve through having a more diverse workforce is the ability to have more perspectives, different perspectives, to build better products, to solve complex problems. You know, we know from the research that if you have people who think differently, if you have cognitive diversity on teams, they will be better placed to solve difficult problems. And certainly when you have problems at a scale touching so many people, they're all difficult problems. So the more diversity we have, the better we are at solving those problems. So if your goal is to get to the cognitive diversity, how you sort of back into that is practically through trying to increase representation of people who have had different experiences, who come from different backgrounds, different identities. You know, all of it matters. All of it matters in increasing the cognitive diversity, but you focus, for instance, in your recruiting efforts, in your recruiting strategies, we would focus on certain groups where we have the data and where we know that increasing diversity in those groups would help us to contribute to our cognitive diversity. In inclusion, you can do it on every spectrum, everywhere, every characteristic, because what you're looking for in inclusion is to have an environment that can support all difference, right? So even the strategies you use around recruitment are somewhat different, or I should say the groups you can engage. We don't have all the data on every way in which someone is different from another person. For inclusion, we have data in certain categories that can help us focus our recruitment efforts, but all of it ladders up to trying to increase the cognitive diversity of our teams.
And thank you for explaining that. Such a big, I mean, it's a massive undertaking. So when you're talking about cognitive diversity and Facebook's goals, what does success look like? Are you measuring success holistically across the organization? Or are you going into different offices around the globe and saying, you know, we don't have enough diversity in this area and we need to make changes? I would just love to know the process a little bit.
Yeah, and again, I think for every company it's different. The size of the company, where you operate, all of those things will determine how you scope it. So for us, what is success? It's more. It's having more diversity and more inclusion, right? And what you can measure, as I was saying before, what you can measure is representation in certain categories. Knowing from the research that if we increase that representation, we're going to get more cognitive diversity. Even what you can measure varies by country. So in the United States, we can have a good measure on race, ethnicity, gender, veteran status, and disability status. There are many countries where we might only have gender.
Right.
And then you would have to build on the recruiting side, because again, on inclusion, you can build for all. But on the recruiting side, because that is sort of limited by, well, what groups would you partner with? What is known to you, right? When somebody is applying, we have chosen to institute a diverse slate approach strategy for increasing our representation, the part of it which is around hiring. which means
Mhm.
that we've set the expectation that there be a diverse slate of people who are qualified for this job, that we're interviewing for this job, right? You need to give people the opportunity to compete for the jobs if you're going to have the opportunity to hire a more diverse set of people.
Right.
But what we know in that space will vary depending on the country that we're in, depending on what other metrics are held or gathered or collected, right? There are some countries where we'd have disability. There's some countries where we would have veteran status information. So again, depending on the size of your company, depending on your resources, I think you'll see a different set of complexity, a different approach. For us, we would do an all up and then we would do specific, depending on country org, because you're also not just looking at how many people are in the population.
Right.
You're also looking at how many people are in these particular segments or are in this particular field. So it's all very, you can keep going to as granular level as you can imagine. And I think for every company, you have to sort of see what are the resources. We deliberately built out quite a robust diversity and inclusion team, along with a very robust people analytics team. And that is very key for us. Our people analytics team now rolls very deep.
Yes.
And
yes.
and it is made up of people who are race experts, bias experts, psychologists, social psychologists, data scientists, and statisticians. And so we can really dig in to what would be market availability, to even have a look at, well, how off are we in terms of representation? But we can also apply those skills in the data science and the people analytics field to our inclusion metrics as well. So what success looks like is a more diverse population in a healthier, more inclusive environment that is fair for all, where we can give everybody the opportunity to produce and to perform at their potential, right? Where we've reduced the amount of bias that would discount performance by some and give, sort of credit to others. We know of things like performance attribution bias, where certain people come in there with an assumption that they'll be successful. That's a thing of society that we see in many workplaces. And we're looking for those things. We're deliberately looking for them and trying to build a more fair systems to reduce, if we can't eliminate, the occurrence of those things.
Yeah, performance attribution bias. That's very, very interesting.
It's where we see generosity to certain groups of people
Right.
who tend to be in the more powerful categories in a society.
Yes. I want to take it a little step back too, and just, you talked about very, very ambitious structures and organizational goals. Can you tell us a little bit about your day-to-day and how you get all this done? We have a lot of people who are listening who are in D&I jobs, and I mean, you're in a massive organization. What do you do every day?
Well, my day-to-day has really changed, even between my last job and this one. In my last job, I worked for a global law firm, right? Over 2,000 lawyers in many, many countries around the world. I had done a stint in New York and in Geneva, spent a couple of years there working with this firm. And only now, while I'm at Facebook, do I understand how very different it is when your scale is at the scale we are. So what that means for the day-to-day is that I think, before, my day-to-day could be very focused on what I'd planned. I could set goals, I have a project, this is a thing I want to roll out, I want to deliver this, and I can, that's what I know when I get up in the morning, that my goal is to push that a little bit further, to do more in that space. My day-to-day now is far less predictable because of the impact that our products have on the world. Because we tend to be so connected to people's expression, because voice is so critical, and because people's experiences are now, and even more so now, being represented through our products and our platforms. And it's a vehicle for so much that, what's going on in the world has a much more immediate impact on what I'm focused on. Because in my role as Chief Diversity Officer, I'm both trying to support the diverse community of people who use our products, but really importantly, the diverse community of people who are building our products, who are writing our policies, who are supporting all of our initiatives, the people who work at Facebook. And those people are in many countries around the world. Those people are members of the very society. So it is a really hard time, for instance, right now, when we look at what is going on in America with the visualization of brutality. If you are somebody in the Black population and you work for Facebook, you are a human being. If you are somebody who is in the Black population who works for Facebook, who lives in America, you are a Black person living in America who is facing so much of what we are now seeing. And that creates a burden that is so hard to describe. But in my role, right, I may wake up one morning and there's been another killing. And that means that things have to shift, in that what I need to focus on that day is how am I supporting the people who work here. So it's, you know, it's more unpredictable.
Yeah.
We try, thankfully, we again have invested in quite a robust, it's the biggest D&I team I certainly have ever worked on. And, you know, as I hire people, I know that many come saying it's usually them alone, or it's them and one other person. You know, that would be a typical team. You know, if you had 5 people, you'd think you were balling. We have a team of about 30 people.
38?
About 30 people, but that's just the I remember we work closely with an even bigger team of people, analytics people, the L&D, people growth. And so what it does allow us to do is, even if we have to shift focus at moments depending on what's going on in the world, we can still keep you know, as much on track as possible, recognizing that even the people on my team are often people from underrepresented groups who are impacted by what's going on in society. But we can generally have continued focus on pushing forward on our strategies and allow some space for responding to, you know, what's going on and when we need to reprioritize, pivot, shift a bit. So I think the answer is it depends what my day is like. I have plans. Sometimes those plans have to shift, but it's always in the interest of more inclusion.
Yeah, definitely. I think some of the talent leaders, the D&I leaders who are at major companies would like to hear some advice too on how you keep everybody focused when you have so much public scrutiny. You touched on it, but you know, you said that there are people at Facebook who are living this experience right now, very personally affected by it, and so
yeah,
strong and focused right now.
Yeah, look, it's not always easy. As I said, like, we're human beings too, right? So sometimes it's literally giving people space to be, having grace with that. We do a lot of that. But generally, what I can say is it's because we're a mission-driven company that people keep coming back to the core. When you're on the inside, you know, we receive so many signals and direct messages of the good that our products do in the world. The ability to showcase even the bad is a benefit. You know, we know, for instance, that a lot of the injustice that has been highlighted has literally been shown on our platforms, right? It is awful to watch, but it is because people have seen it that we are seeing now more efforts towards a more just society. And so I think everybody who chooses this work and chooses to do it at Facebook, you're sort of, it's a crew of people who quite deeply believe in the power of what we're doing, in the good that it can bring. And that's where people go to, even when it's hard, to sort of reground themselves and commit to continuing the work. But as human beings, you know, I would never pretend that it's, you know, every day, all day, we're like, yeah, because it's hard. it's hard. But at the core, we just believe that what we're doing has so many benefits to society. And that's why we want to do it as well as we can. That's why we commit, right, to learning more, to doing better. That even when we do things, even when we slip, we keep recommitting because we believe in the power of what we can deliver.
Definitely.
But you have to remind yourself of it sometimes because it can be hard. Right.
And thank you for showing up and being here, and you know, that speaks volumes as well. So I also often think that, I mean, you have to keep doing the work you're doing. You are this global community. You, as you said, you are the place where the videos are posted, and the work needs to continue. So it's quite exceptional. Let's speak a little bit about COVID-19, because in the last couple of weeks, obviously, we are, with the murder of George Floyd, we've had an incredibly important attention shift, and change is happening. But before that, you were doing a lot of work through the platform with certain communities that were very affected by COVID-19. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Yeah, and we're still doing the COVID work, right?
Yes.
I mean, this is going back to your question of what's your typical day like?
Yes.
You know, nobody knew that the home team horror of racism would come along and knock COVID off of the front pages. And while it has done so, it hasn't reduced the impact of COVID. So we're still trying to manage through the impact that COVID has had, and particularly in, again, these most vulnerable communities. So what we did once it hit was, we had to focus on our people, right? Put your gas mask on first, like make sure that the people who work for Facebook were safe, get people out of the office. You know, for people in HR, I am sure you went through many of the similar challenges of how did you disperse an office or offices, right? How did you get people the ability to work from home? You know, literally practical things like recognizing everybody wasn't in the same place, right? And this is the thing about inequity, or the thing about sort of different differences in privilege. Some people could have easily gone to a home office, which is a dedicated space, and they were good to go right away. Everybody isn't that fortunate to have been operating like that. So we had to think about things like that. So for instance, as we thought through inclusion from that perspective, you know, we decided to give everyone a stipend to allow them to equip themselves as much as they could to have a space. We shipped people new technology. Again, all of this, it was an interesting sort of additional way to implement your practices around inclusion, right? Which we hadn't anticipated before, but it's all part of inclusion and managing inclusively. So, you know, we've always taken the position on D&I that our goal is to integrate D&I into all of our systems. I am old enough that I have gone through downturns in the economy before, and I have seen that when that happens, functions like D&I are more susceptible to being cut, downgraded, defunded. And I never wanted that to happen again. And so the approach we've taken from the beginning is to integrate D&I into everything, to have our resources be spent, for instance, building the capability of everybody in HR to be more focused, working with the teams who run our performance management systems to make sure that inclusion was built in to what we do. And by the way, this is a journey. So I'm not saying like mission accomplished, it's the work we continue to do every day. But when COVID hit, it brought new challenges too. So we had to navigate through those. How are we taking care of our people? And then how are we going to take care now of the people who more than ever need our services? Because people couldn't physically be together.
Right.
And now this was the only way in some countries that people were able to communicate, right? And so literally making sure our infrastructure could manage the load was a whole thing. While, P.S., removing people from our offices. So you need more people to support the weight, but you needed those people to be protected themselves. So it was challenge upon challenge. And then as we began to see how the disease, how this virus was hitting certain populations, that then made us also focus on what could we uniquely do to help.
Mhm.
And we essentially pivoted everything in the company towards COVID efforts. We thought about small businesses and how they would be impacted. 42% of small businesses in this country are women owned and 37% are minority owned. We knew those were also likely to be the businesses that had the hardest time to get access to capital. They were going to be most impacted by childcare needs, and they were going to be in industries hardest hit, like hospitality, right? So with all of the whammies happening, we felt we had to go in there and try to help where we could. So we announced a $100 million global grant for small and medium businesses, with 50% of that money going to US and 50% of that going specifically to minority-owned, women-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses, the ones we knew that would be even more impacted than others. That's an example of one of the things we did. So we're making our own systems, our platforms work for the people. And then on top of that, we built a COVID information hub with reliable information, because we could see that that was making a big difference, literally life or death, whether people had the right information. There were awful, memes and misinformation going around about who could and couldn't get the disease. I remember the Black community and how it hurt me to hear people saying in the beginning, Black people had some gene, something that was preventing us, when in fact, we were dying at higher rates, infected at higher rates. Getting credible information was so important. So we built this COVID information center. But then connecting through sources and people who people trusted mattered. So we had a partnership with Univision. We had a partnership with BET. To make sure we were getting the information through the sources people would listen to as well, from experts. We did, relief funds. We helped news outlets. And again, looking as well at, which were African-American owned, which were Latino, where could we help those who needed the most help? So there were a number of efforts we did when, as I said, the impact of COVID began to be quite clear. Efforts that continue because it hasn't gone away.
Right.
Because racism has come along to, kick it out of the spotlight, because racism was always there too. So we just now have, parallel tragedies that we are trying to get through.
Yeah. Well, and I think one could argue that COVID has been, maybe the silver lining is that so many people who tried to ignore racism have been now realize that they've been living in a racist country and they've in a racist system, and COVID has really helped expose that even more. So,
it's an interesting point. I think there will be sociologists who will do studies for years to come about how being in the midst of the COVID crisis, how that impacted the response we're seeing now on the issues of racism and abuse.
Yeah.
Because I think there is a relationship there.
Right. There's no denying the truth that we're all seeing.
But the question is, right, why didn't people see it before? It's not like people of color haven't been saying it before. We've been saying it, we've been singing it, we've been drawing it, we've been painting it, and yet still it didn't seem to sink in. And so it will be interesting to see as it's teased out. Why now? Yeah,
definitely. I think I studied history in college, and the connections always to something. History is never on its own, so I think there'll be a lot written about this. In many ways, my generation is lucky, and my children's generation, that if we can fix this, and we can't. It's going to take a huge amount of time, and by the time even my children are of age, my plan is that they will be anti-racist and be aware and be educated in ways that I wasn't educated in my position of privilege. And so that's what's fascinating to me. To the point of this, it's going to take generations still. How are you preparing your teams around this marathon? Like, what is the self-care? I had a talk with Ariana Huffington yesterday and Pat Waters, who runs HR at ServiceNow, and they talked about Rosa Parks doing yoga in front of demonstrations, and all these activists being very good around self-care. So I'm wondering if that's happening within your group at Facebook.
Yeah.
This marathon.
Yeah. again, if you're in D&I work, you sort of know this is a marathon. It's
Yeah.
an interesting, I'm in a metrics driven company, and people are used to setting a goal, hitting that goal. Great. Let me set another goal. Whereas if you are in the work of, anti-oppression, anti-racism, of having equal opportunity for all, you sort of know that progress is your target even if you never get to victory. Because human beings are always going to create systems of oppression where there's going to be dominant groups and less dominant ones, and more powerful and less powerful, and they'll find different reasons to exclude. So race is one, ethnicity is one, gender is one, sexual orientation, gender identity, I could keep going on, right? Differently abled people, it's just depending on your religion. So sadly, yes, you sort of have to come to terms when you're in this work with the fact that it is a marathon, but you do set your sights on progress. And in terms of self-care, this is where I think being in an environment where people keep coming back to the fact that we are human beings in this. And human beings suffer, and we feel, and we're not robots. Having grace, giving space, that's something that we try to build in, but then I talked about how we try to make fair systems. So what I never want to do is to have to depend on somebody who gets it to then confer, to give that space. We want to build it in the system that you're also entitled to that space. So, with COVID, we've created new categories of leave to give people more space, to take care of themselves and to take care of the others too. And again, when you look at the compounding effects, if we see the statistics, right, Native Americans are so much more likely, look at what's going on in the Navajo Nation, right? If you're a Native American person working at Facebook impacted by this, you have so many compounded things. You might be sick yourself, you might be caring for somebody else who is sick, right? More so than other people. So having more room built in. So we had more leaves built into the system, which people are entitled to take to care for themselves and others during COVID. I think that was really important to make it structurally available. Then we give grace, that matters. Then we've really sort of ramped up our investments in the opportunity to access mental health care. Knowing that there is someone you can call, knowing there's a space you can go to. We have our FBRGs, which is our resource groups, have been, it's interesting being an innovation culture. You kind of take a breath when things change. And you're like, wait, what do I do now? Because I still have this goal to support people, to build community, but all of a sudden I can't be together, because that was a lot of the way we defaulted to doing it, right? To be in the space, think of, you'd say, oh, I have a hug for you, and now we can't do that. And so we kind of took a breath, and then the FBRGs, redouble their efforts to connect people. We are doing for Juneteenth a full day of learning and education and celebration around the Black experience, around the history, and a lot of that is driven by people in our team, but also, people in the FBRGs participating. And so we've really, thought about community and what it is, and then what is the moment we're in to give more, to support, so that the care is available if people need it. And then the permission to do the self-care along with the structural opportunity through having leave.
I'm fascinated by how Facebook, which you said you have a culture of togetherness. I remember going to the office back in 2009 when it was very small, and and sort of being wowed by the concept of that open office back then. And I was at the Washington Post at the time, which was a very different looking office. And I've been in the office more recently, but how that transition is really interesting to me. But my other question is, do you think that this transition to remote will actually allow you to put more diversity into teams at Facebook, because sort of lifting requirements to come into an office in relatively expensive or hard to access cities, I shouldn't say expensive, but say areas where we know that certain areas, they're not very diverse, right? So.
Right. Yeah, so it's an interesting question. And the top lines, I would say it's too early to tell, because there will be advantages and then there will be some great risks. I would say, if I had to be sort of very clinical, cut and dry, there are more advantages on the diverse hiring side of the equation, because now you can, there would have been people in cities where it's not worth it for them to leave their city where they have their community and their family, even their church if they're a religious person, to come across the country to be in Silicon Valley, or even to move to one of our other offices in the United States. But now, if we have more remote hiring, all of a sudden you open up those talent pools, and that would be a huge boom. On the other hand, we haven't yet figured out, and I don't know that, maybe there are some companies who are at this size who have been fully remote. We haven't yet figured out, how do you avoid some of the pitfalls that might happen on the inclusion side, right?
Talk about those, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
or we can fix them, yeah.
Yeah, there's enough third-party research to suggest that, what we talked before about performance attribution bias, there's something called affinity bias, right? Where people have an affinity for others who are like them. How people build bonds has traditionally been in person. I came from a law firm world where people would talk about FaceTime, right? You wanted to put in FaceTime. You wanted to show you were in the office until a certain hour, right? We know, in coming from minority community, that it's not made up when people say you often have to, in corporate America, work twice as hard to get half as far, right? I've seen the studies that have shown, for instance, as I said, I came from a law firm world, that people would say, oh, we are the most elite. We only hire from the top law firms, law schools. And then when you looked behind, when you did the research, you saw that, actually, for many of the white partners, they didn't come from top law firms, but 80% of the black partners did. 80% of the partners of color. Isn't that interesting, right? Because what you were seeing was that for them, they had to be, they had to work twice as hard. All of that sort of environment of who gets opportunity, who gets on the best deals, is often premised on what your connection is to somebody else. If people are now operating in a remote way, where they're not building that, where they don't have the FaceTime, where they're not top of mind, is it going to default to affinity bias, where you just assume the people who look like you are the ones who are, and performance attribution bias, who are better at these jobs, that they get the opportunity? How do you avoid invisibility, and how do you make sure equal opportunity exists? I'm putting these out as questions because I don't know that we've figured out what would we, again, what we like to do is build it into the system, make it structurally available, not just depend on people getting it and doing the right thing. We are also working, through L&D on all sorts of developmental programs and training to make people more conscious, to equip them to do better behaviors. And while that is going on, you also want to make sure structurally you can, as much as possible, give everybody a fair opportunity. I don't know that we have the answers yet for how you do that if everybody is remote, to make sure on inclusion, you're not losing something. And, that's part of why we've said that we are going to take a measured approach to this. We're not going to just today for tomorrow say, okay, everybody remote, because I just think that we need more time to work out how we're going to do this right, so that there aren't immediate winners and losers, and so that we deliberately think about what is inclusion in this context and what does it require.
Can you speak a little bit to what a measured approach looks like?
Well, first of all, it's taking time to do the research, right? What is out there? How have other remote organizations operated? What have they experienced? What has worked? What hasn't? Like literally doing that work. Then thinking about what do we have the resources to do? What kinds of teams? I mean, that takes analysis. What kinds of teams might perform better or worse in a dispersed situation, right? What teams would work better? We're building hardware now, right? Does that make sense for the hardware teams to be? You see what I mean? So it's not as easy as saying, yeah, everybody go. You actually have to do that kind of analysis, and then, as I said, integrated into that, what does inclusion look like? What would we need to build? There may have been things which were on a best practice for D&I list in the past, then we had determined in our, as you talk about, we have open floor plan. I cannot tell you how much I miss it. I miss it desperately now that we are all working from home.
No, what parts? Because some people say they need open floor plans, so I want to the positives.
Miss it because I now realize in a real way what I only sort of accepted intellectually. I walked into an open floor plan at Facebook. I sort of accepted it. People said, you know, this is deliberate because it helps in innovation and, you know, all sorts of ideas flourish when people can, when there aren't walls, you know, when you can run into each other and build together. I kind of, I accepted it. But until it was taken away from me, I didn't really feel it. And now, oh, I miss it. I now see that so much of what happened and what could happen in terms of building together, collaboration would happen because of those open floor plans, because there were cafeterias. So, you know, look, many days I might come home hungry, even though I had free food because I didn't have the time. Like I was so into the work, right? But the truth is, if I did have it, I could always go and you would run into somebody. It would spark an idea. You'd sit with people. You'd hear about a discipline you weren't familiar with. That would spark an idea in you about how you could integrate some of that thinking. We have so many cross-functional teams, and those again, it's cognitive diversity, right? So the open floor plan allowed for a certain flourishing of that, which now that we are separated physically, we are relying on technology. Thank goodness, we have good enough technology to do this, but it's requiring you to sort of pivot, you know, in how you build together. And again, when you think about how do you do that with inclusion, where everybody has the same opportunity to build and be successful, I just think there's a lot we have to figure out. What are we going to do systematically across all functions, across all offices, if this is going to work? So that's why we have to take a measured approach. We have teams who are like 100% focused now on figuring out some of what I've just described to you, and many, many more questions.
Right.
So
I'm excited to see what they produce, and that maybe Facebook will produce a open floor plan virtual product. So,
well, yes, we'll see.
We can finally be in Second Life or something.
Like messenger rooms is a little bit of that. You must try it out.
Yes. Well, I feel like I live much of my life in there anyway. So,
yes.
So I have some great community questions that I want to go to, and they're a little bit more specific. So, you know, one of them is how can you hold business leaders accountable for prioritizing diversity and inclusion efforts? You know, when you're within a small company that doesn't have a team, doesn't have an initiative, and even with everything going on, you would think they would understand, but.
Yes, so it does get harder depending on your level of resources and buy-in, right? The fact is that if you can get the leaders of the company to understand how critical this is for their business, that it will allow them to do better business, that's of course like a first victory. That convincing doesn't have to be done by somebody who is a full-time D&I person. Right? In many places, in fact, it didn't happen through that route. So if you are somebody who is at the company, if you're somebody, certainly if you're in HR, you have the opportunity to do that influencing. What I've seen is that, again, data wins arguments a lot. And there is now, thankfully, you know, when I started in D&I 15 years ago, there were less sort of dynamic, current research papers that showed the direct connection between having more diversity in your teams and having better products, making more money. But now there's enough of that out there, right? That anyone can take advantage of that to help make the case. So I do think that makes a difference. I think having, you know, part of accountability is assigning resources to address this issue. So having somebody who is in charge full-time of D&I matters. People play with different models, and sometimes you think distributed responsibility might be best because then you get more people accountable. What I think actually works best is that plus somebody or some people who are 100% accountable. Because in the first model, what can sometimes happen is that some other priority comes up and that person who, you know, runs a line of business all of a sudden is pulled out and they're not really focused on driving this forward. But having at least one person who is full-time focused on this, and that person can sit in HR, they don't have to be, you know, a separate D&I, but somebody who is focused on this, maybe they could be sitting in recruiting, depending on what's your balance in your, you know, you could be a startup and you're like, we need to, hiring more is the most important thing right now. And then it could be somebody in recruiting. But so the point is, I think having a mixed model where you have some people, hopefully people with some authority in the company who are sharing responsibility along with somebody who's driving it, that makes a difference. And then, look, I've also seen different approaches to goal setting. So I've seen companies go out there and say, these are the goals we have around diversity, and this is, you know, we're going to hold leaders accountable for this. But they haven't built the infrastructure. They haven't built the strategies. They don't have the tools that would allow the people who they've now made accountable to be able to operationalize and to be able to deliver on that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, like, it sort of sounds good in a headline, you know, we're holding these leaders accountable, but if the goal is to actually get to progress, then I think you sort of want to do that when you have some strategies built out, when you have some resources behind it that those people you're holding accountable can now implement to make it work. You know, we did years of building out strategies, testing things, seeing what worked, building up a team before we set public goals and before we made our most senior leaders accountable for diversity goals, inclusion goals in their performance reviews. And so now we have a combination, which I think is ideal, but I recognize that everybody isn't there, right? And I would just say, like, think substantively for your company, in your environment, with the level of buy-in you have, what works as opposed to just, you know, doing what people say is the most important thing.
Well, I think this feeds on to a next question where Annie asks, you know, how do you not appear disingenuous? Like at these times, how do you bridge the gap between doing what you think you should be doing? And obviously we had a great talk yesterday on empty allyship, led by a woman named Sherelle Dorsey from The Plug, where she tracked what companies were saying versus what they were doing. So, you know, I think you answered the question already, but how do you not appear disingenuous?
Look, I mean, by doing work, but also knowing, you know, if you are in D&I, there are oftentimes you feel defeated because you know how much work you are doing, but because people don't see progress at the level that we all want, you can feel deflated.
Right.
So I think, look, the way you not seem disingenuous is by being real about it. You know, putting a real effort into this and making real change.
Yeah.
But you also have to talk about self-care. When you are a warrior on this field, you also have to be able to know your truth, because there are many times where it will feel like you're pushing this ball up this very, very big hill. And I mean, goodness knows, you know, every day you wake up and you're like, oh, the hill just got higher. Interesting.
Yeah. Sisyphean is the word.
Yeah, but knowing what you are putting into it, there has been progress, right? And we should not lose sight of that. When I look at, like, you know, we want to see so much more at Facebook. I would love to see our 50% goals hit, but also in every category we measure, I want to see more. But I know that when we started on this journey in 2014, for instance, only 15% of the people who were in technical jobs at Facebook were women. That number is now 23% by our last report, and we're going to issue another report sometime soon. That is progress, you know? 2% of the people who were in non-technical jobs were Black. It's now 8%. That is progress. You know, it was 6% Hispanic, it's now 9%. That is progress. Women in leadership. We had 23% women in leadership when we began this journey. We now have 33%. That is progress. So even though it's not 50,
Right.
which I want,
Getting there. Yeah.
it's progress. And so, whether you seem disingenuous or whether you are disingenuous are two different things. I think if you're committed and you're doing and you're showing progress, then you sort of have the receipts to show that you're
Right.
not disingenuous, even if you're not where you want to be.
Right. You have the evidence. Yes, and thank you for giving us the numbers too. So I want to end with this great question about Pride Month, because we are in Pride Month. So it's a bit of a long question, but it's a good question. As we are now in Pride Month, it is clear that any Pride Month programming must be intersectional. Given the problematic history of highlighting cisgender white men during Pride/corporate Pride promotions, do you have any recommendations for intersectional programming that disrupts this narrative? The question goes on, but I think you have the gist here about highlighting Black LGBTQI voices. And
I think in the question, the questioner has almost answered it, which is making people conscious of the history, conscious of the intersectionality, and conscious of where, remember I said before, human beings are always going to make power hierarchies, right? And just because we happen to be from an underrepresented or marginalized group doesn't mean we don't act in the same way as all human beings do, right? So, within the community, there are then these, there's, different spaces that different groups occupy, and subgroups, and even more underrepresented and more marginalized. And what it requires is for all of us to keep focusing on how do we lift up the all, right? But also, because the questioner asked about, what do we do? What programming? One thing I would say is go to the community, ask the community who is closest to this, who is at the intersection, to offer ideas for programming. We've done something recently at Facebook where we have opened up for everybody in the company to submit ideas in certain categories. Now, we're a tech company, and the idea of a hackathon is very much something that we sort of ascribe to. We've built some of the most amazing things, Safety Check, which is a feature where people can check themselves safe during a natural disaster, is something that was created by an intern during a hackathon, right? We know what can happen when you open it up for all ideas. And, in this time, for instance, we're soliciting ideas from our whole population around racial justice work. What should we be doing in product, in integrity, in policy, in community? And because it is Pride Month, we've also had suggestions around intersectional things that the company can do. How do we show up in Pride Month, right? What are we highlighting? When we make stickers, what's in those stickers, right? Are those, literally, this is the type of thing, I'm working a lot more now on product inclusion and policy inclusion. And as you do that, representation matters in there too, because, you've heard it said a million times, but, what you see, you believe. And if I see trans people being held up in something that might seem small to people, but in the image we use, how does that make me feel, right? What does that say about what I regard and about where I place dignity and respect? So whoever you are, whatever company you are, whatever your product is, however you show up in the world, there is something that uniquely you can do for this representation to be more inclusive. And so, rather than talk about what Facebook can do, I've said some of the things, what I think we all have to do is think back to what are we uniquely placed to do, and how do we lift what we are now conscious of, so that we can represent all and reduce all of this hierarchy, all of these sort of, exclusionary spaces that we've built as human beings, to get us back to an open floor plan.
You must do this a lot. You really wrapped it all up for me. Thank you. Well, it was fantastic speaking with you, and I'm going to let you go to back to your very, very busy job, and I know that there's a lot of work that's being done, and I see it with your teams as well, and the work that they do with us through PowerToFly. So
thank you so much, and to everybody who tuned in, thank you, and
yes.
We just have to keep pushing. It's one foot in front of the other.
Yes, thank you.
Fight the good fight.
Inspired me as well.